Josh here with Unicycle.com. Today we're going to cover in this video how to remove a bearing and also a crank arm. For tools, you will need a bearing puller, a crank arm extractor, a socket, a 22mm deep wall socket, or a cutoff section of a 25/4 seat post will work, an 8mm Allen wrench, and then we like to use our pedal wrench combo tool. Also, having a tape measure that uses metric measurements will work as well. And then you will need either a hammer or a mini sledge. All right, for instructional purposes only, we decided to use the hub and the crank arm that we're talking about, and of course the bearing. So first off, you need to remove the crank arm to get to the bearing. So you take your 8mm Allen wrench and you loosen it. So then you take the 2-in-1 crank puller. You want to make sure you take the 2-in-1 crank puller and tighten it all the way down. That way you don't strip the threads as you're extracting the crank arm. Then you snug this down. Take an 8mm Allen wrench. And this will pull the crank arm off. And then you remove the spacers, set them off to the side. You may want to use a rag to wipe off the excess grease. Per the specifications, the ISIS axle needs to have lubrication on it. Any synthetic or lithium white grease will work just fine. Then you take our crank arm puller and you slide it over the axle. You will probably need to unscrew the extractor shaft to be able to make room for it to show on the axle. And then our handy dandy crank arm pedal wrench is great because it has all the tools you need that work with all our tools. And this will slowly extract the bearing off of it. Now keep in mind, aluminum axles and aluminum one-piece hubs are really noisy, so it will take a little bit more effort depending on the hub that you have. Once you pull the bearing off and you replace the bearing, you take the new bearing and you would press it onto the hub. And this is where you would need either a 22mm deep wall socket. It clears the axle, but it presses on the inside race of the bearing. This is important. If it hits the dust shield or the outside of the race, you take a chance of damaging that bearing. We also have found out that some of the aluminum seat posts that are 25/4 or 27.2mm in diameter, if you clean that cutoff section, it will slide over the axle and also allow you to press it on. So what we do is we take the deep wall socket here, and then you can either use a mini sledgehammer or a regular hammer to press fit this bearing back on. And then you want to check against the light to make sure that there's no air gap in here. And once you make sure that there's no air gap, then you can go ahead and put your spacers back on. And then if you have any kind of lubrication like we talked before with the grease, you want to make sure that you add just a light coating of grease on there. And then now we need to take the crank arm and pull that 2-in-1 crank puller off. And then once that's done, you can press that back onto the axle. And then you can tighten this nut down. And we usually recommend you tightening the crank nut down to about 49 to 69 Newton meters. And there are conversions if you have a foot-pounds torque wrench. We thank you very much and have a great day.